Thank you, Marcy, and thank you so much for having us. We're really excited to be here today with all of you and to have a conversation around marijuana and vaping prevention.
Good afternoon, everyone. This is Richard von Feldt. I'm so happy to be with you all, and we hope this is a useful presentation to you. And we're happy to stay a little later if any of those who need to would like to ask questions, or any time afterwards you want to follow up with us, let us know how we can help.
Great. So we will be sharing slides throughout this presentation. And, before we get started, we just wanted to introduce you a little bit to our mission, why we do this work. So Richard and I founded our organization Panaptic several years ago because we were seeing a rise, not only in the rates of young people using marijuana, but also a rise in other substance use as well. And so we have committed ourselves to providing evidence-based information and research to young people, to families and communities who could contribute to helping our young people, our students, make healthy choices for their lives.
And so like Sarah was saying, our clients are anyone really who is in contact with young people. So we service high schools, colleges, universities, healthcare organizations, state organizations, and we really try to target the whole community. So helping both the young people as well as the parents and families and educators, physicians, therapists, anyone who is really in a place to have an engaging scientific conversation or helpful conversation with the team. And we do that through webinars, through other forms of live educations, as well as digital prevention platforms that we've created.
And we're so excited to be here with all of you because in your roles as educators, as educational leaders, you have such an amazing ability to profoundly impact the students that you support. And for prevention, and marijuana prevention in particular, that's just so critical. And so when we think about how do we protect students, how do we support them in making healthy choices, related to marijuana use and vaping, one of the first things to think about is how can we become well-informed? Because I will tell you, and you're probably already aware, your students are probably doing a lot of research on their own, either through Dr. Google or other internet searches, or receiving information about the potential medicinal or recreational benefits of using. And also it's important for us to think about what are the current methods of use now, and how does potency vary across each form? Because if we recall what marijuana use used to look like perhaps when we were younger, it's just very different. It's also important for us to consider, and we will be talking about, how does marijuana use impact the brain, and how might it impact the brains of students who already have mental health conditions? And then finally, thinking about how can we create environments where students feel supported to check in and get help if needed, and how do we have productive conversations with students? And as we are prevention focused psychologists, we always are thinking, how do we reach the entire community? How do we shift a culture where in our larger culture, marijuana use is becoming more of the norm? So if Richard and I are successful today, these are the things that we're hoping to talk about and much more. But we also are aware that our talk is only as useful as it's relevant to you. And so as you have questions or thoughts, please feel free to type them in the chat box, and we will take pause at various points to make sure we all check in. Oh, I forgot my last little bubble, which is the really key and important piece of how do we engage our parents, right? Because often parents have such a pivotal role, as we know, in shaping our students' lives, and it's often tricky to figure out how to engage them and keep them active in conversations for prevention. So in thinking about what we're facing, it's just important to acknowledge that the marijuana culture and just beliefs culturally that we hold across the United States about marijuana are shifting. So cannabis is legal in 11 states recreationally, and many, many more for medicinal reasons across the country. And what research shows us is when something is medicinally or recreationally legalized, perceptions of risk related to that substance always go down. And so what we're seeing, especially with young people, is this rising belief that marijuana use is harmless, and can even be helpful for a variety of things, including mental health reasons.
Thank you, Will. Well, sorry about that. So, so the medical marijuana industry, as well as the recreational marijuana industry, is expected to grow to be about 55, it seems as high as 75 billion by 2024. So a lot of the messages that are already out there have been marketed for about the last 10 years. So we're kind of playing a catch-up game when it comes to marijuana prevention. A company that was Philip Morris, now called Altria, has invested $12.8 billion into the vaping industry and buying out one of the most popular forms of vaping, which you all have heard much about. We have also seen investments from the tobacco industry into the actual growing of marijuana. One such purchase was $1.8 billion into Kronos, which is one of the companies that's one of the largest producers of marijuana. As well, we know that Canada has just legalized marijuana and Mexico is soon to come. So, you know, our teens, our parents, our educators are all going to be surrounded by the messages that come out of that large industry, and which is why prevention is so important. And lastly, even companies like Coca-Cola investing in products that you'll be seeing more commonly in legalized states for personal use, for beverages that have THC in it. So it's going to be kind of an interesting next 10 years as we see a whole slew of new THC-based products in our future, as well as the messaging that supports the purchase of such things.
So what we'd like to do is introduce, in thinking about how does cannabis affect the brain, it's important to note the two main mechanisms of action. So one is THC, which is short for delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol. THC is the more psychoactive ingredient in cannabis. And so for THC is the ingredient that creates that feeling of being high. But you also probably heard quite a bit about CBD, which is cannabidiol, which is the less psychoactive ingredient. It has been purported to have a number of potentially medicinal benefits, but not much research is in actually regarding how it can impact the developing adolescent brain and brains over time. But what we're going to largely be focusing on is THC and the impact that THC can have on adolescent brains in particular.
So before we jump into that, we want to just kind of review some of the old methods of use. So no longer is it popular as much as it was 10, 15 years ago even to use blunts or joints or bongs. We're seeing a whole new slew of what I would want to offer to you to think about this as more like delivery methods for THC. And that is now mostly popular in the form of vaping, which, as you all know.
Yeah. And it's important when we think about potency. So when potency of THC in the flower form of marijuana, which is the green bud, stuff that people would often smoke, the potency of the THC percentage in marijuana back in the 60s was 1 to 2%. Fast forward a little bit into the 80s, the average THC percentage of marijuana was 3%. Later in the 80s, it went up to about 9% due to cultivation and what we learned about horticultural practices. And then now it's important to note that for the bud or the flower of the plant, the average across the country is about 19% THC, but it can range anywhere up to 30%. And so I think that's important for those of us in the room who perhaps grew up before the 80s or who were exposed to what folks said marijuana was like a long time ago, to realize that even when we think about joints or those other methods of smoking that Richard just named, that the marijuana is just way stronger now than it used to be. And so because it's more potent, because it's more strong, it has a greater ability to impact the brain, and especially the developing adolescent brain. There are also other forms that are commonly used, and so these are what we would call the class of marijuana concentrates. They're created by blasting the plant with very sort of high temperature butane, actually, and extracting these concentrates from the plant. And so some of the names for this could be dabs, which you may have likely heard of, shatter, butter, honey oil. Some of the, butter and honey oil are often used in edibles. But also one thing that can be created from this is the concentrates that are used for various forms of vaping, like Juuls. The average THC percentage or potency for these concentrated forms of marijuana is 65%, but the THC levels can be 97 to 99% in some forms. So one of the things that I find personally alarming as a parent and as a psychologist is when I think about these forms, especially when teens are vaping, because if they are, they're often vaping concentrates, which we'll talk about in a little bit, that the THC potency is really high, which challenges that idea that vaping is safer.
So why are more teens vaping? Well, one thing for sure is that it's become kind of an exciting new area for teens to explore because of all the different products that you can use to vape. But also it's really easy to disguise. So remember, vaping doesn't produce a smoke, it produces a vapor. You also get a higher THC potency or even more nicotine when you vape versus smoking. It's very discreet, there's no odor. Parents or teachers can't tell the difference really between the smell being able to distinguish between it being nicotine or marijuana. And there's also a perception amongst both teens as well as adults that it's healthier. In fact, the vaping industry is spending a lot of money in promoting that it is a healthier way to get nicotine and or other substances into your body. As well as you can use lots of different forms in a vaping device, such as concentrates like Sarah mentioned before. So one of the things that makes it dangerous, and I'm sure you all are tapped into the knowledge, the news that's come out recently about the dangers of vaping, is that there's lots of different ways to kind of make your own homemade vaping device. But even in the mainstream products that you can buy that are not homemade, the liquids which have nicotine and nicotine salts in them, which has a higher concentration of nicotine. You have propylene glycol or other vegetable glycerins that help as kind of carriers of the tobacco and or THC. And then you can mix all different kinds of concentrates in that. So there's been a large outbreak in lung injury. We're up to, as of last week, 2,711 cases in over 50 states. New York, I think you're kind of in the middle with around 100 to 150 incidents of lung injuries. And most of the deaths, I'll say, have been with individuals above the age of 50. However, a large portion of people with injuries themselves have been, the greater portion have been between 18 to about 35. Now, about 82% of the lung injuries have been reported with those using THC, and about 33% exclusively with THC. So I want you all to know that the CDC is still put out a very clear message, even though there's been a decline in lung injuries since about September, to avoid vaping at this time. And that's a pretty rare occurrence that they would go up against a multi-billion-dollar industry to say, we suggest you not vape at this time. And they especially encourage anyone from making their own vaping solvents, because that is where a lot of the problems have come from. We think the main reason for lung injuries is due to a vitamin E acetate, and yet there's still more studies being done. But the good news is there is a bit of a drop in the and the lung injuries since a lot of the awareness came out about the potential dangers of vaping. So the other things that makes vaping dangerous is, of course, you get a higher concentration of nicotine. There's heavy metals in vaping, in vapor rather, that includes things like lead and nickel and tin. So the devices that heat up the concentrate over time disintegrate, and that is inhaled. There's also volatile organic compounds and other cancer-causing chemicals. Even the flavoring has known to be dangerous as well. The other challenging thing about vaping that makes it more dangerous is that anytime you heat a chemical up above 400 degrees, oftentimes it becomes, it can change its chemical form. So there's a chemical compound called myclobutanol that's used in the farming industry, in the almond industry and other industries to help prevent mildew from growing on flowers. And the marijuana industry decided to take on the use of myclobutanol. Once it's absorbed through the root system, it then becomes part of the flower and actually stays in soil for up to a full year. But what people didn't realize is that when myclobutanol is heated, it becomes hydrogen cyanide gas. So those farmers who are using that, and a recent Berkeley study that I saw a couple of months ago showed about 24% of samples had myclobutanol in it. I think, which again is just kind of one of those hidden dangers you wouldn't have known about.
So before we move forward, actually, there are two vaping specific questions that I think would be helpful if we touch on before we shift gears into our next topic. One
Sure.
that Marcy asked is, when our students vape, will they show the signs of being high that we're used to seeing, like bloodshot eyes, enlarged irises? You know, I would say the signs of, and Richard, I invite you to chime in and or correct me, but I think that the signs of being high are different. So the bloodshot eyes, you may not see as much. Richard, what are your thoughts?
Well, depending on how often you've used THC, you may or may not see any kind of physical signs. If someone's new to using it, then I would expect that you would see glossy eyes, potentially red bloodshot eyes. But I think students are pretty savvy. They oftentimes use eye drops to get rid of the bloodshot eyes. So it makes it kind of difficult to detect. Sarah and I, who work in addiction medicine and a treatment center, oftentimes will have 7 or 8 different doctors scratching their head wondering, was that person under the influence or not? So it's hard to tell, to be honest with you. However, if someone's using edibles, I think the high is much stronger and thus has more physical features that of someone looking more tired or fully kind of dissociated based on how powerful the THC is from edible use. And we'll tell you more about that later on in the presentation.
Mm-hmm. And then the last vaping related question, Mark had asked, how are the lung injuries correlated with vaping? And I think that what we're hearing and learning is, one, that vaping is inhaling a vapor, right? That we assumed, that was assumed in the beginning to be safer than inhaling other things, but it can be toxic to the lungs, especially when other chemical compounds like THC, nicotine are present. But also those heavy metals that Richard was speaking about, because the vape devices heat things to such a high temperature, we're really not sure what people's lungs are being exposed to, especially if they are introducing nicotine. You know, even the flavored e-juices and pods, you know, it's a question mark, even if it's just a flavor, how that impacts someone's lungs, because it's inhaling chemicals and vapors that have been heated to a very high temperature. So we're continuing to learn, actually. Yeah. So one thing we want to think about too, over the last 10 years, because the marketing messages have, I believe, gotten ahead of prevention with marijuana specifically, is that the perceptions of risks with teenagers has changed drastically. So
if you look at one of the gold standards out of the University of Michigan, the Monitoring the Future study, there is a question that's asked amongst many that asks 8th graders, 10th graders, and 12th graders, do you think smoking marijuana regularly is harmful? And so we look back at 2009 and you see 69% of 8th graders, 59% of 10th graders, and 52% of 12th graders said, yeah, I think it would be harmful. Fast forward to 2018, and we've seen a real shift in that perception of harmfulness. So 8th graders is down 16.9%, 10th graders is down 21.4%, and 12th graders is down 25.7%. And again, the question is, do you think smoking marijuana regularly is harmful? So it's one of the reasons why, and Sarah and I have been following that study for many, many years, that we decided to create or take on the mission of really having marijuana-specific prevention to at least help young people know that there is harm associated with it versus nothing at all.
Mm-hmm. And so what does this mean in terms of what our students are experiencing? What we're seeing now is that twice as many teens use marijuana regularly than smoke cigarettes, which is good about the cigarettes, not good about the marijuana. And then the number one rising group of people who are using marijuana almost every day or daily are those aged 18 to 21. And so when we think about what happens for students when they graduate, often 18 to 21-year-olds are using quite a bit. And we'll share how that can impact their lives. One question we often get that we just wanted to sort of talk about early on is this question of how addictive is marijuana? So the research shows that of grown-ups, aged 21 and up is the way they often measure grown-ups in these studies, 9% of people who try marijuana will experience addiction. However, because of the critical period of development for the adolescent brain, 1 in 6 adolescents who try marijuana on average will struggle with addiction. And that number has shifted dramatically in recent years. I collaborate on several research studies focused on adolescent health, and one of my mentors just shared with me that she's been worried because that number is getting closer to 1 in 5. And so we're seeing with this rise in potency a real shift in the number of people who struggle with substance use problems related to marijuana. Teens, for a variety of factors, are 2 to 4 times as likely than adults to develop an addiction within 2 years of starting using, which means that during this period of time in upper school is a really important time for students to get support and receive some accurate information and a prevention message. So I want to, we did just touch on a couple vaping related questions. There are several that are just coming in that we can touch on briefly, and then I want to continue to move forward into what does this mean for students' lives. One question was, if students are vaping THC and get drug tested, would they test positive? The answer to that is yes, they would, because the THC is still in their system. And then there's 2 questions kind of targeting this idea of, we've heard that marijuana isn't as addictive because you don't have physical withdrawals or it's not physically addictive. And I would say, and Richard as always has a great response to this too, so I want to invite you to chime in as well, Richard. But what we're seeing are 2 things. One is that the process of addiction is one where someone continues to use past experimentation into regular use despite having some negative consequences in their lives, where they begin to rely on the substance to feel okay. And so that, we definitely do see that process of addiction occurring with marijuana. And then the other piece is that we do see signs of physical addiction. They're just not the same signs that one would see with alcohol, where one might, someone might shake, or with opiates where they get violently ill. With marijuana addiction, there are physical signs. We might see insomnia. You might see higher anxiety in the withdrawal phase. You also might notice feeling nauseous or not having an appetite. Richard, what else would you add in terms of that piece?
Well, so marijuana dependence is in some ways more subtle in the beginning, but after even 1 year of use, like Sarah said, there are many side effects, and it definitely is a physically dependent drug. And I think one of the reasons why it's misunderstood is that people don't understand it as being a physically dependent drug. We are seeing more. You probably are aware, some of you, of cyclical vomiting syndromes related just to marijuana. That's a sign of dependence. And then a lot of mental health problems related to dependence that we'll get to in our upcoming slides.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you so much.
Yeah.
And I think there's another question, two more that I just want to target, and then we will move on. One is this question: is marijuana a gateway drug, the way that it was thought of before? And on this front, we can say that the research is very clear. One can develop an addiction to marijuana as much as one can to any other substance, alcohol, opiates, or otherwise. When someone has developed that dependence or addiction to marijuana, they are also 3 times more likely than their peers to struggle with opiate addiction in its various forms. And so we definitely can see that. The 2 other questions are related to resources for students, resources for all of you to follow up. We have created a document for all of you with links to sources that we trust in terms of the research in various content areas that I'd be happy to share with Marcy so that she can send it out to all of you after our talk today. And we're also happy to talk about student-specific resources and also resources for schools later in our talk or individually after. We have a lot to share in that front as well. So. But in the spirit of making sure we cover what we'd like to today, I think it would be good to move forward. And one thing we just wanted to acknowledge is that something I'm sure all of you know very well, which is that the teenage brain in particular is evolving and growing. So when we're born, we have billions of brain cells, 1.8 billion brain cells. And our brain cells communicate with each other through chemicals that pass through the synapse, the space between cells, and is processed by our neurons and receptor sites. The reason that adolescence is such a critical period of time is because the adolescent brain is still growing and still developing. And the last part of our brain to grow and develop around the age of 25 approximately is the frontal lobe. The frontal lobe is the part of our brain that's considered our executive functioning. It's the part of our brain that helps us to set goals and break down the steps needed to achieve it. Our source of motivation and inspiration is definitely housed in that frontal lobe. It also gives us our sense of what behavior is appropriate when, or a sense of what consequences we might experience as a result of our actions. I had a teacher once who said that adolescents don't have the aha moments as much as they have the oh no moments. So sometimes, because that frontal lobe is still developing, young people learn through experimentation and through learning through what doesn't work just as much as what does. And as a result of all of that, it's very possible for your students to be highly motivated, great kids, very smart, very engaged, very committed to music or art or athletics or academics, and still make some poor choices because that sense and that ability to anticipate negative consequences is still developing. And how does this relate to THC? Because of the brain chemicals that we have, the THC mimics the endocannabinoids, the cannabinoid system, which is a system, a negative feedback system in our brain that regulates the functioning, the ebb and flow of all of our other neurotransmitters or brain chemicals. And so that when one uses THC, because it mimics our natural cannabinoids, it's synthetically similar, then what happens is that that's the system of our brain that begins to be impacted in pretty profound ways. We have cannabinoid receptors in really important parts of our brain. So the parts of our brain that are involved in memory and cognition, in our feelings of motivation, our appetite, and even our immune system and reproductive system. but also the parts of our brain that regulate our movement, our coordination, our feelings of pain, physical or emotional, our emotion center of the brain as well. And so when we look at this list, these are the areas that start to be impacted when somebody uses marijuana. Richard, I think you're on mute.
So what does that really mean to the academic abilities of a student? One study that we found really interesting was from Dr. Stacy Gruber out of the McLean Hospital, and she studied chronic marijuana users and had them performing neurocognitive tests and measured how their brain was working compared to teens who were not using at all. And so she had them do IQ tests and like drawing, pattern recognition, and verbal tasks and other kinds of word tests to really kind of assess how their brains were learning, but also how they were functioning while solving various problems. And what she noticed, and this is due to the receptor sites in various parts of the brain that Sarah pointed out earlier, because of the receptor sites being plugged and not functioning properly, she noticed that participants had to use different parts of their brains as non-users to complete certain parts of the tests, and that they had to work harder just to keep up. Which points sometimes to the frustration that we see in early adopters in the high school years. The other thing that came out of Duke University with a study of over 1,000 participants, measuring their IQ throughout their lifetime from 5 times between the ages of 13 and 38. So the age of 13, 18, 21, 26, 32, and 38. Testing for IQ at all of those stages showed that for those who started using marijuana earlier in life, there was as much as an 8-point drop in IQ that did not reverse over time. The other impact of marijuana use can be seen when looking at the actual nerves and how they're firing in real time. There is a well-known company here in San Francisco that does single photon emission computed tomography, which is essentially giving you like a live view of how your nerves are interacting in real time. And through different images of the brain, they can show you whether or not you have a learning disability, whether you have anxiety problems, whether you've had a traumatic brain injury, and many things. But they also did studies on cannabis use disorder, and they showed that what you're looking at is a screen here. On the far right side, you see a normal temporal lobe, and you see that it's kind of smooth, not a lot of dark spots. The colors represent nerve activity. If you go to the far left-hand part of the screen, you see a 16-year-old's temporal lobe who had 2-year daily use pattern, and in the middle, an 18-year-old with a 3-year history using 4 times a week. All of the dark spots, or what look like kind of cavities, if you will, are areas where the nerve cells are not firing. So because those receptor sites have been plugged through consistent interaction with THC, and remember THC is more longer lasting and sticky than our natural anandamides, those receptor sites stop working, and that's what you're seeing in those visual representations. We also have a slide we got recently of a 28-year-old who used just 1 time a week, and it looked very similar to the 18-year-old, even with a 3-year history of 4 times a week. So we're seeing even axonal nerve damage, even with as little as 1 time a week, and we'll show you some more research here moving forward.
So, of course, all of those changes can certainly impact academic performance, how one's cognitive functioning. The other area where we see a pretty profound impact is the impact on mental health. And so we wanted to share with you some research related to that as well. So what we see is that teens who even just use, not just, but who use marijuana once a week are 2.5 times more likely to struggle with an anxiety disorder at age 21 than their peers who are not using weekly. And one of the things that this particular study looked at was if they stopped using, say in their early 20s or later in their teen years, does that make a difference? And what they found is even if the young person stopped using, they were still doubly as likely to have an anxiety disorder at age 29 than they would have been had they not been using. This is, I should just note, largely because we have a lot of the cannabinoid receptors, which are the brain cells that are impacted when one uses marijuana, that in our amygdala. So the amygdala is the emotion center of our brain. It's the part of our brain that tells us if we're safe or not. It's the part of our brain that gets activated when someone falls in love or has a wonderful time with their friends, or if they have a spiritual connection, or they're listening to music or seeing art that really moves them. And so we think that the impact on anxiety in particular, but certainly on mental health, has to do with the impact on the amygdala. Mark was asking a question about if the anxiety could lead to use. What research does show is that 75%, 3 out of 4, people who use marijuana also experience an anxiety disorder or depression or some other mental health condition. However, so I would suspect that people who struggle with a mental health condition are always much more likely to use substances, marijuana or otherwise. The research in that regard is clear. This particular study did control for that to see, with peer-reviewed research often, especially when we're looking at young people, it's very hard to say cause and effect. Like, it's very hard to study someone before they use, make sure they do use marijuana, and then test them after, because ethically there's some real problems with that. However, the correlational data, which looks at, this cohort of young people, we measure, we evaluate their mental health at their age 14 for this study and continue to follow them through their late 20s and control for variables like who had pre-existing anxiety, who had problems at home, et cetera. What they found when they controlled for all of those variables that could have confused these results, they still saw this shift. That's a great question, and one that we ask a lot, actually. We also see a shift in terms of the experience of depression. So for young people who use marijuana prior to the age of 18, again, controlling for pre-existing conditions and other factors, they were 1.4 times more likely to experience depression than their peers who did not use. And they were 1.5 times more likely to struggle with thoughts of suicide than their peers who did not use.
Yeah, so one of the very important twin study that looked at identical twins, one twin who had never used marijuana, another one had become dependent using it beginning in earlier part of adolescence, that they were 2.5 to 3.5 times more likely to attempt suicide. And there's been actually multiple identical twin studies that we've compared research to, and they're, again, between the 2.5 to 3.5 times more likely to attempt suicide, which is, again, due to the receptor site damage. The other thing that we're seeing, too, is an impact on psychosis. So for teens who have histories of thought disorders or medical histories of thought disorders in their family, we're seeing earlier onsets of thought disorders. Thought disorder would be like schizophrenia or schizoaffective disorder. Normally that starts in the mid-20s. We're seeing them now starting as early as 17, 18 years old. As well, you should know that dabbing or using edibles, which puts a very high dose, a very high potency dose of marijuana in your body instantly, will create hallucinatory effects. Sarah and I work in the emergency room on call and are seeing more and more frequent visitors who have called poison control centers and come into the emergency room terrified that of what they're experiencing, not knowing that it was just caused by marijuana. From edible use is probably one of our highest, one of the things that's causing it the most. And we're also, Sarah and I work with the University of San Francisco, and we're seeing that more often with some of their freshman and sophomore classes who are experimenting more often with edibles and having a number of powerful psychotic events.
So this is our last bit of bad news, by the way, and then we're going to talk about what do we do about all of this, because I think that's an important part of the conversation too. So we wanted to look at how can marijuana use impact the developing brain and life outcomes. And there was a pretty comprehensive study conducted in New Zealand that we wanted to share and note. And as you can see on this graph, there are a whole bunch of lines. And on the right-hand side, it shares numbers. So those numbers are for the number of times somebody used marijuana between the ages of 14 to 21. So if you look at the peach color, that's 400 plus times. 400 on average is about once a week between that 7-year span of time. And, you know, the orange folks are the never folks. They've never used marijuana at all. If we look at these graphs, it's important to note that for the folks who used once a week on average or more in their high school years and college years, they were much less likely to graduate from college than their peers who didn't use. They were also slightly more likely to be unemployed and much more likely to need support financially to get by in their mid-20s. And so when I think about how, you know, the adolescent brain, that frontal lobe that's still developing, is the part of our brains that allow us to look ahead and anticipate what can happen as a result of our decisions. You know, for students, that part is still developing for them. They're still learning how to do that because their brain is still growing. And often they are not thinking about these things, right? That if I use more frequently, I might not see a problem now, but I might be less likely to graduate from college or to achieve my dream job or the things that motivate them to succeed.
So we're not going to spend a lot of time on medical marijuana, but one thing I just want to say to all of you is that still to this day, the American Cancer Society is not recommending marijuana use. The American Pediatric Association is not recommending marijuana use. And also physicians, whether you're an adult or a teen, anyone who has a pre-existing mental health condition is not recommended to use marijuana.
And we wanted to share this with you because we hear a lot from schools across the country that yet teens or even their parents believe that using can help with things like test anxiety or sleep or other anxiety-related conditions. And it's just important to know that it's actually not recommended at all for someone struggling with anything related to mental health. So we wanted to shift gears now to what do we do with all this information, right? How can schools really effectively prevent problems that students could develop with marijuana? How do you support your academic community?
And so in order to do that,
Go ahead, Richard, I'm sorry.
No worries. Well, I mean, one of the things we have to think about is, again, what influences students to use marijuana in the first place? Because understanding that is going to help you to focus where you're going to put your prevention efforts. So looking at the SAMHSA, or the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration meta-analysis of over 200 different studies looking at the influences of what causes students to use marijuana, there's 10 main reasons you want to look at. One, of course, and these might sound obvious, but I wanted to point them out anyway, that first of all, any kind of positive attitudes towards marijuana on the campus is going to affect that. Second one is that there's a belief that it's healthy to use, or that marijuana is a good drug to help you deal with stress or anxiety or sleep issues or appetite, as Sarah was saying earlier, and we are hearing that a lot more often. Or another factor is that your parents or your family use it, so why should they tell me not to use it? We've seen that problem for years and years and years, of course, with alcohol. The perception of availability. So if a teen thinks it's easy to get, that will increase, of course, the likelihood that they will eventually will. Also, positive attitudes towards drugs in general will affect a student eventually trying marijuana. The next 5 include parents who do little to monitor their teen's use of marijuana, having friends who use marijuana, a perception that a lot of your friends do use marijuana, even if they don't, but even just the perception that everyone's doing it. Community law enforcement being more permissive over use. And so in New York, I think you all know that adults who get caught with around 24 ounces of marijuana is still considered like $100 fine. So that is definitely sending out a message that even if you were caught as an adult, it's not that big of a deal, which teens then think, all right, if I get caught, it can't be that big of a deal either. That influences their youth, as well as it just being easy to obtain, as we talked about earlier.
The other thing I would just note is, sometimes we think parents who do little to monitor their teens or communities that are permissive. One of the things that Richard and I find is that it might not even be a matter of permissiveness, but if parents, if schools, if communities don't know what to look out for marijuana today, they might be permissive, right? If a parent doesn't know what a jewel looks like or what jewels can actually contain, that someone could use it for vaping, they're not going to do anything about it because they're not familiar with it. And I think that with the changing landscape of how students are using, that familiarity and understanding is a real issue.
Well, and to add to that too, again, more parents are coming to us defending the teen's right because of the wellness messages that is coming out of the tobacco industry, that their child needs it to fall asleep or they need it to study more effectively. We've gotten a lot of, believe it or not, children even as young as 5 years old are being given marijuana to help sleep better if they're having trouble falling asleep. So this is kind of becoming more culturally acceptable, which also kind of feeds into that idea of permissiveness. So thinking about it from a different perspective, I think is good to do. So what to do next, you all? Sarah and I are a big believer that, and looking at all the prevention research that's out there, that the most effective way to reduce the likelihood of any kind of marijuana abuse is to take a community-based approach to prevention. And where you're not just educating the students, but educating the parents, as you all know, as well as educators and administrators. Because even a 2-minute conversation with your favorite teacher, getting feedback about their own understanding of the science of marijuana could be enough to plant a seed and change the behavior or attitudes or beliefs of a student. So we really believe in teaching schools to teach students, parents, and educators to have productive conversations about both the science of marijuana and how it impacts the brain, why it isn't harmless. I think that's a big mission if you could be on just affecting the harmlessness rates alone. In your school, you're winning if you're driving those numbers down. Helping them understand the impact of how it affects their career and academic performance, so they really understand the cause and effect of that. And then doing things to help them deal with peer pressure, which is a really challenging thing to do. How do you say no? How do you get out of using when it's becoming more and more popular? And then teaching students and parents, how do you know, and educators too, how do you know if a student has an addiction problem to marijuana? What are the signs of it? And then most importantly, and lastly, how do you help a student get help? How do you kind of instruct them on when to pull the parachute, if you will, to getting either help for themselves or to encourage one of their friends getting help? And all of those elements combined kind of provide you with the best ability to reduce the risks of abuse.
Mm-hmm. And I think that what Richard and I are finding and what we're learning from the research are two additional things. One, that school is the ideal place to introduce prevention because it's really, all of you cultivate such strong and connected academic communities that include families, that include your students, that include your faculty, you all have such a profound ability to impact your students in every way, including their choices around substance use. And so, finding ways to draw in parents and students in an innovative way, I think is what we want to invite all of you to think about and do. And if ever we can be of support, Richard and I have lots of ideas about how to do that. It's what we work on all the time, actually. And so we just want to invite you to reach out to us at any point if we can be of support, or if we can target any questions or thoughts you have. I want to just pull this up because it has our email addresses here if you did want to get in contact. And Marcy shared with us that this eSeminar ends promptly on time at 5. So I'm actually, I have to say, feeling quite proud. Richard and I weren't sure if we would share with you the information we wanted to in this time. But, we have had conversation that if there's interest in focusing more specifically on the what to do side, the prevention, ways to talk to students, et cetera, we would be more than happy to offer a part 2 conversation where we could focus on the tools specifically.
Thank you, Sarah.